I want to focus my remarks on the future of the peace plan and its compliance with international law. In my mandate, we've been tracking for many years and documenting Israeli violations of international law in the name of counterterrorism. And I'm deeply concerned that elements of the plan are destined to fail to bring a secure and lasting peace. With other mandate holders earlier in the year, we set out our key concerns about the peace plan. We welcomed, of course, that there is a permanent ceasefire, the rapid release of hostages and unlawfully detained Palestinians, some of them, the opening of humanitarian aid under United Nations supervision, that there would be no forced displacement from Gaza, the withdrawal of Israeli forces, and the non-annexation of territory. Now, all of these things, by the way, are requirements of international law and shouldn't depend upon negotiations and other parties giving these things to Palestinians. But we were very concerned that key elements of the plan are deeply inconsistent with fundamental rules of international law, including those set out by the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion last year, and indeed the most recent advisory opinion from the court. Imposing a peace at any price, regardless of law and justice, is a recipe for further injustice, violence, and instability. So as this peace plan gets implemented, it's absolutely vital to remedy its flaws in order to ensure that peace comes with justice and respect for international law. Our first concern, obviously, is that the plan does not guarantee, ultimately, Palestinian self-determination, statehood, and self-governance. All of these are conditioned on vague preconditions about Gaza's redevelopment, Palestinian Authority reform, dialogue with Israel. And so Palestine's future is put at the mercy of decisions made by outsiders and is not in the hands of Palestinians themselves, as international law requires. By requiring further negotiations with Israel, it preserves the failed status quo, which has not worked since Oslo. And we know that the Israeli Prime Minister has already declared that Israel would forcibly resist statehood. This is not a peace plan. It's blatantly against the International Court of Justice's finding that fulfilling the right of self-determination cannot be made conditional on negotiations. The temporary transitional government is not representative of Palestinians and even excludes the Palestinian Authority, further lacking legitimacy and violating self-determination. There are no concrete benchmarks or timelines for a transition to representative governance, which belongs to Palestinians alone. Oversight by the so-called Board of Peace, chaired by the US president, is not under United Nations authority or under transparent multilateral control, when we know that the United States is a deeply partisan supporter of Israel and not an honest broker. This proposal is regrettably reminiscent of colonial practices and must be rejected. An international stabilization force outside the control of Palestinians and the United Nations as a guarantor would replace Israeli occupation with a US-led occupation, as well as a continuation of partial Israeli occupation in so-called buffer zones. And there's no timeline for an absolute or unconditional Israeli withdrawal. The demilitarization of Gaza has no end date, and if permanent, could leave Palestine vulnerable to future Israeli aggression, when we know there's a long pattern of Israeli aggression in Palestine and indeed elsewhere in the region. Nothing is said about placing military constraints on Israel, which has committed protracted unlawful occupation and international crimes in Palestine and further afield. Gaza must de-radicalize, but all of the hateful, inflammatory, genocidal rhetoric against Palestinians and Arabs on the Israeli side is not addressed at all in the plan. The plan treats Gaza in isolation from the West Bank, not as a single unified territory. The economic development plan could result in illegal foreign exploitation of resources without Palestinian consent, as we've seen in previous occupations led by the United States. There's no duty on Israel to compensate Palestinians for illegal war damage. Why should Arab states or the Europeans pay for illegal damage inflicted by Israel? The plan provides for the release of all Israeli hostages, but only some of the many thousands of arbitrarily detained Palestinians. Amnesties given to some Hamas members appear to be unconditional, even if they committed international crimes, thus denying justice for victims. Above all, what is incredibly striking about this plan is that it does not address accountability at all for Israeli international crimes and serious human rights violations against Palestinians. There's no commitment to transitional justice, truth-telling, or reconciliation. And we know from many past conflicts that accountability and justice are absolutely essential to a sustainable peace. The plan doesn't address other fundamental issues like ending Israeli illegal settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the resolution of borders, compensation, refugee return. And the plan, above all, doesn't provide any leading role for the United Nations through collective security under the Security Council, controlled by the General Assembly, or even a resumption of the leading role of UNRWA in assisting and protecting Palestinian refugees. Any peace plan must respect the ground rules of international law. The future of Palestine must be in the hands of Palestinians, not imposed by outsiders under extreme conditions of duress. The International Court of Justice has been crystal clear. Conditions cannot be placed on Palestinian self-determination. The Israeli occupation must end immediately, unconditionally, with due reparation made to Palestinians. The United Nations, not Israel or its ally, the United States, has been identified by the International Court as the legitimate authority to oversee the end of occupation and the transitional towards a political solution that guarantees self-determination. Excellencies, in conclusion, I just want to state once again my profound rejection of the United States' sanctions on my dear colleague, the Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory. I call on all states to denounce those sanctions and for the United States to immediately lift them. I also condemn the remarks this week in the General Assembly by the Israeli ambassador, deeply sexist and hateful and toxic remarks which have absolutely no role and are absolutely unacceptable in international diplomacy. Thank you.